So hi, I'm Dr. Alfred Hinton with the City of Houston's Housing and Community Development Department. We are glad everyone made it. Today, we are going to experience the final results of the market value analysis and economic development investment study. Over time, some of you have actually participated in our local stakeholder meetings to give your input, and our consultants, Reinvestment Fund, have acknowledged those, and you'll probably be able to see some of those concerns or some of those factors addressed in this presentation. Uh, with that, I will say after the final presentation, the local stakeholder presentation, we will be making sure that this is available to all in our Housing Resource and Data Center, which is our website, in the City of Houston website. And I will put that link in so everyone can have access to that in the future. We're redesigning it right now. There's some good information in it now, but we're making sure that we design it more for the community and the institutions out in the urban fabric of the city of Houston. With that, I will now turn it over to Reinvestment Fund.
Thanks so much, Doc. Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here with you this morning, and we're really pleased that so many of you have taken the time to join us here for our final stakeholder group meeting. I am curious if anybody is here for the first time. If anybody wants to just stay in the chat, if you're here for the first time, I think it's possible people might have missed our first two meetings. My colleagues Jacob and Ira were in Houston last week and attended the Houston Housing Collaborative event, and I know they got a lot of good information there. Our partner Curtis Davis, who's here in the meeting, has also been going out and talking with a lot of other folks who haven't necessarily been in part of here. All right, so we do have a couple first timers. Hi, Jeremiah, welcome. But it's really great to have everybody here. So Jacob, can you go ahead and, okay, yes. And we did, I know, invite people that we saw on Friday. So I'm glad some of you folks did show up today. Great, this is great. Wonderful. So we will provide a little bit of background information for those who are new to the stakeholder process. Great, thanks, Jacob. So we're here to talk about the 2022 Houston Market Value Analysis. This is our third MVA in Houston. Next slide. So today we're going to talk about an overview of the market value analysis, what it is, how we do it. Then Jacob will walk you through the results of the 2022 MVA. Uh-oh, we're getting a little bit of an echo. I don't know if other people hear that, but if everyone can mute, hopefully we can put a stop to that. Great. And then the folks at Working Partner will talk about the economic development investment analysis. Then we'll talk about some other factors that influence markets and market development around housing affordability, mortgage credit and lending, around flood risk and vacant land. And then we'll close with the discussion of our analysis of displacement risk and what that looks like across the city. And we'll pause for discussion at a few different points. If anybody has questions throughout, please drop it in the chat. Jacob and I are going to be monitoring that to make sure we address any questions you might have. So we're always willing to stop and address those to make sure everybody's on the same page. All right, next slide. So first we will talk about the methodology. So the market value analysis is a data-driven tool. It helps both policymakers, residents, other stakeholders understand the characteristics of their local real estate market, as well as the variety of their markets. It's objective, it's based in data, We use local administrative data, and we validate that with local experts. And so that's all of you who are here on this call. You're our local experts. So throughout the process, we've had people vet the data, vet the models, tell us if we're missing anything, if we need to change anything, and that's always makes our work a lot more rigorous. So thank you. So the MBA can be used to precisely target intervention strategies in weak markets, and also can be used in strong markets to support sustainable and equitable growth. And the idea is that the MBA can help guide those interventions to where they'll be most effective and where they're most needed. Next slide. So to ground us, I want to just review the principles that underlie our approach to the MBA, which is that public subsidy is scarce. There will never be enough public dollars to meet all the needs in housing markets, and subsidies alone cannot create a market. So public policy and subsidy has to leverage private investment and create the conditions for private investment to occur. We believe that there is strength in every market. So when we show the markets that are from strong to weak, weak markets need investment too. And you can build in strength in those more distressed markets by investing near their strong assets. So every market, no matter how distressed, has something that is a kernel of strength, and that might be an institution of sometimes a college or a university, sometimes a public park, sometimes a transportation center that could be built off of. We believe that all residents are customers and they have an expectation of quality public services and amenities. And finally, the best decisions we believe are based on sound and objective analysis of both quantitative and qualitative data. Next slide. So the MBA process begins with acquiring local administrative data and putting that at block group level boundaries. We then manually inspect and validate those layers by driving around. I'll show you the map of our driving in a minute. You know, Houston's is probably the largest place where we work, so a lot more driving than we do anywhere else. But we got to see a whole lot of Houston neighborhoods on our 3 trips. Then we use the statistical analysis to create clusters that group all of the block groups in the city into categories that have common attributes within those categories. Then we again do an inspection. We drive around to determine if it conforms with what local experts believe are the circumstances in the markets and what we're seeing on the ground. And then that's an iterative process. Then we adjust the model. We go back in the field, we validate. And finally at step 6, which is where we are today, we're reporting to you on the summary of those findings and the results of the final MBA process. This data validation throughout the process is really critical to having robust results. We believe that the geographic scale matters, and that's why we work at the block group level, because we believe there's a lot of, it is our experience from doing these studies that there's a lot of variation within traditional neighborhood boundaries, and it's important to be able to drill down and see that variety. One size doesn't fit all. Every city is unique. We have unique sets of indicators, and sometimes those indicators change over time, even within the same city, and we had to do that this year. We'll talk about that in a bit. And finally, bringing in local knowledge is essential as well. So we always test with local experts to ensure that what we're seeing and what we're developing is accurate. Next slide. So this is the map of our validation drives. You can see a whole lot of squiggles where we went round and around some blocks within different neighborhoods. So the green trip was back in June. The yellow was in August, and then just last week, Jacob and Ira made that green line, those sets of green squiggles, to fill in what they hadn't yet seen. And so just some of the general observations were that there was substantial appreciation across all market types since 2018 when we last did an MBA. The new vacancy measures we tried to use were overly sensitive, so we had to adjust those. We observed that there was substantial construction and renovation across all middle and strong markets. And we found that there were some markets that were unclassifiable because unclassifiable in our typical statistical approach because they contain these large rental complexes and there were no home sales that help us agree their model. So we had to categorize those manually. Next slide. All right, and now I'm going to turn it over to Jacob to talk about the results.
Thanks, Emily, and good morning, everybody. Like Emily said, my name is Jacob Rosh. I'm with the Reinvestment Fund, and what I'm going to do today is talk you through the results of the 2022 market value analysis, what went into the model, what are the different types of markets we identified. So as we go through, I'm going to be showing you lots of maps, lots of data tables. We're going to make all of this available to you at the end of this, and Doc and his team have been working on some great ways to share this data. So if there's questions along the way, please put them in the chat. Emily's going to be monitoring that, and we'll pause a couple of times to answer questions. So let's dive into it. So like Emily mentioned, this is our third MVA for the City of Houston. We completed the first one in 2013. We updated it in 2016, and now today in 2022, we have our third iteration. So since this is our third time doing it, I thought it'd be helpful to just kind of talk about how the model has evolved over time. You know, obviously the conditions in Houston have changed in the 9 years or so since we started doing this. But the model that we've been using since 2016 has been largely consistent with a couple of kind of evolutions along the way. So when we did our first MBA in 2013, which is that sort of bottom map in the left corner of your screen, we really focused just on the core of the city. In 2016, we expanded our analysis of sort of the whole of the city, and we did that again today. And this year we made a couple tweaks to our data, which I'll highlight in just a second. Largely to respond to the way that the pandemic kind of influenced some of the underlying indicators of the model. The results are largely comparable to what we did in the past. The approach we took is the same, but there's a couple kind of small tweaks to the model that we had to make this year. And as we go through the results, I'll make sure to point those out so everyone's aware. So like Emily mentioned, the market value analysis is a typology of neighborhoods based on the housing conditions and market strength of those neighborhoods. And the approach we use is a sort of statistical model that takes different characteristics of places and then develops like I said, a typology out of them. So what's really critical in that analysis is what are the underlying indicators you're using to create your model. And so this what you see on your slide here is a list of all the indicators we put into the model. And this is different in every city because the sort of housing market in every city is a little different. But we sort of grouped our underlying indicators in sort of three general buckets that are pretty consistent across cities. The first set of indicators tell us something about the level of property value, property prices, and level of investment in a community. So that's things like home prices, median home prices, the variation in home prices in an area, and then the level of development measured by new construction and renovation. For the 2022 model, we included a new indicator of housing renovation, which wasn't something we had done in the past, but as we were doing that validation that Emily told you about just a second ago, one of the things we realized is there's a lot of markets in the city that didn't have a lot of new construction activity, but had a lot of sort of substantial housing renovation, whether it was gut rehabs or just kind of putting a new coat of paint on the outside of a home. Capturing that kind of resident-driven investment was really critical for separating out some of the different markets that we identified in the city. So that's a new indicator we have this year. The rest were all indicators we used back in 2016. The next sort of set of indicators we put into the model tell us something about the level of vacancy, housing blight, and distress in different markets. So we measure that here in Houston by looking at the level of foreclosure filings and also housing vacancy. Housing vacancy is an indicator that we had to make a couple changes to. I'm happy to go more into detail of this if folks are interested, but I'll just say in the past we measured vacancy in Houston by looking at water shutoffs, so basically using utility data. Because there was a pause in utility shutoffs during the pandemic, that indicator by itself wasn't incredibly helpful. So we developed a new indicator incorporating a couple additional data sets, so looking at low water usage in addition to shutoffs, locations of demolished buildings, dangerous buildings, et cetera. So we did a lot of kind of on the ground validating to make sure this measure of vacancy was as accurate as we could get. And then finally, we have a set of indicators that tell us something about that aren't necessarily sort of positive or negative to a market, but tell us something about the sort of characteristic of homes. So things like owner occupancy, the level of subsidized housing available in different communities, and then the land use. So commercial, residential, industrial, et cetera. As you can see from the right side of the screen there, that's the data sources we used. Much of this data is pulled from local administrative data, and Doc and his team were incredibly helpful in helping us kind of gather all these data sets. But there are there's really just one variable we used here, owner occupancy, that comes from the census. So the rest is very geographically precise and local sort of up to the minute data. So this is the map of the 2022 Houston MVA. So what you can see is we identified, as we have done in the past, 9 different types of markets. Those markets are colored, different colors. They're listed in the bottom of the screen here. We give each market just sort of an alphabetic name, so A through I. Those purple markets, those are the strongest housing markets in the city. So places where, properties sell very quickly. There's a high level of renovation, new development, highest housing prices in the city. Then you have our blue markets and our yellow markets. These are more sort of middle market areas, more moderate prices, slightly lower levels of development. And then the orange and sort of dark brown neighborhoods represent the most distressed markets in the city. So in this presentation, I'm going to show you a couple, in a minute, just a couple zoom ins on some specific neighborhoods. We'll talk through what exactly each of these market types mean, but just want to flag for people that, all of these results are going to be shared with Doc and his team, and they're going to share them with you. But they'll allow you to kind of, zoom in to specific neighborhoods, specific areas, so you can, get a closer look up and not just see, kind of a citywide view. So I see there's a question there about what do we mean by distressed? Yes, that's a great question. So we'll get to that when we get into what the specific markets indicate in just one second. So what I'm showing you now, this table shows the average characteristics of each one of those 9 housing markets that we identified in the MVA. So we order these markets based on home prices. But as you can see, there's a lot of other inputs that go into the model, just like we talked about before. So things like housing prices, construction, renovation, foreclosure, vacant buildings, subsidized housing, and land use. So I think one of the things that's I just want to point out as we're kind of looking at this overview of all the markets is, although we order these based on housing prices, you can see all of the other variables are kind of jumbled up. There's not a linear relationship between market strength and really any other variable. So we have strong markets, purple, blue markets, that some of which are predominantly homeowner occupied, and some of which have mostly renters in them. We have strong markets with a lot of renovation, strong markets with a little bit of renovation. We have moderate, more distressed markets with a lot of renovation and a little bit of renovation. So I would just point that out to say that each of these markets is quite different from one another. That's the sort of goal of the statistical analysis, but they share certain characteristics. And that's what we're going to talk about more. They have different sort of strengths, different challenges, and we'll get into that in just a second when we go through each of the markets. I showed you a second ago some of the previous MVAs. I just put this slide up quickly because I think it's an interesting sort of piece of context to keep in your mind, which is that over time, as we've been doing these MVAs in Houston, we've observed some pretty substantial changes in the sort of overall housing market. So what this shows is just the median sales price in each of the 9 markets we've identified across our 3 MVAs. And what you can see if you kind of track across the screen there is just how much housing prices, just as one indicator, have really appreciated across the city. Back in 2013, the A housing market, which is the sort of strongest housing market in the city, had a median sales price of $570,000. Today, the A market, which is the sort of comparable, has a median sales price over $1 million. Back in 2013, the most distressed market, the most challenged market we identified, these I housing markets, had a median sales price of $27,000. Today, the I market has a median sales price of $87,000. So the sort of whole market has kind of shifted up. And if you're sort of an eagle-eyed observer, you really know a lot about the 2016 MVA. You'll notice on the map I showed you just a second ago, we've tweaked the coloring. So in past MVAs, we've had sort of 2 purple categories. Now we have 3. We now have 2 blue categories, et cetera. And that's to reflect the fact that there's been a lot of appreciation across the market, and the market as a whole is a lot stronger than it was in the past. So we wanted to reflect that in the way that we colored the maps to help kind of make a more apples to apples comparison across the different models. This is just a little bit about the indicators that have kind of changed over time. If there are questions, I'm happy to come back to this. So let me walk you through what each of the markets mean, and we'll talk more about what we mean by a strong market. What are the conditions of a strong market in Houston and a more distressed market? So as I said, the first sort of set of markets we identified, which we've colored on this map as purple, represent the strongest housing markets in the city of Houston. So what do we mean by market strength? We mean these are communities where, if a home goes up for sale, it's going to sell really quickly. There's a lot of demand for housing here. So if there's a vacant lot, there's going to be someone buying it and, building a new home on it. Housing prices are in these markets, the highest in the city. These are probably places, all of you probably know. This probably isn't surprising to see any of them flagged to you. You probably know these neighborhoods. There's a mix of owner and renter. So the A and the C markets, are predominantly homeowner occupied. That B market, which is that sort of middle purple shade, is predominantly renter occupied. These are markets where you don't see a lot of new construction because they're pretty built out, but you do see a substantial amount of housing renovation, like you can see in the sort of picture on the right here. This is a probably pretty expensive home that someone bought. They're doing a substantial renovation to. There's very little signs of distress, so very little vacancy, few foreclosures. The property maintenance across these neighborhoods is very good. And there's predominantly residential land uses here. You don't have a lot of mixed use. The next sort of strata of markets we identified, we call them blue markets here, have more modest prices, but still generally these markets are pretty strong. The dark blue, that D market, is home to predominantly renters. You can see a picture from one of the neighborhoods we visited as we were driving around. This is the housing market in the city of Houston where we see the most new construction. And much of the construction activity we observed was these kind of townhome developments that are kind of packed in close to each other. Given the share of renters in these markets, assuming many of these are sort of build to rent models, although it's a little difficult to confirm that. These are the E market, which you can see a picture of here on the right, has similar prices to those D markets, but it's predominantly homeowner occupied. These are very solid kind of middle market areas. See a lot of these sort of stone homes, probably built in the 60s and 70s. Very little deferred maintenance on the properties, very little vacancy, and again, predominantly residential land uses. The next strata of markets are these sort of yellowish orangey markets, so F and G. Much more affordable prices. So the prices in these markets are going to be affordable, to a sort of median household in the city of Houston. We see less development activity here, so both less new construction and less renovation. And this is where we start to see slightly more deferred maintenance on the homes. Those F markets and G markets, they have similar prices, but what makes them sort of distinct is F markets are going to be predominantly renters, and G markets, which you see on the right here, are going to be home to predominantly homeowners. Those F markets have a lot of mixed use. some of the highest non-residential land use in the markets we identified. So about 41% of the land area on average is going to be commercial or industrial. And this is where we start to see for the foreclosure rates tick up just a little bit, so slightly higher than some of the stronger markets we've been seeing. H and I represent the sort of weakest housing markets in the city. So lower prices, much more affordable home prices, but this is where we start to see vacant land. We start to see vacant housing. Homes in these markets probably take longer to sell when they go on the market. There's going to be a lot more, presumably, investor activity here, as we'll talk about in a second when we look at, the ability of residents to get mortgages. These are places where it's probably hard to get a mortgage to buy a home. We also see, less kind of neighborhood infrastructure here, as you can see from these, sort of two pictures I pulled out. Lack of sidewalks. We see some of the open drains. Both of these markets, are home to a mix of owner and renters. Those H markets are, kind of half owner, half renter occupied. I markets have slightly more renters. Foreclosure rates are going to be higher here, and we also see higher levels of vacancy. You start to notice, one or two vacant homes, boarded up homes every other block or so. I markets are really the most distressed markets we see in the city of Houston. And, one of the ways that presents itself is these are markets where we see very little sales activity, much less than we saw in other markets. We see very little new construction, probably the lowest in the city, and very, very little renovation as well. So these are markets where there's not a lot of housing activity happening. Also areas with, higher mixed uses of properties. So as I said, I'm just showing you static maps here, but once we share this data out with you, you'll be able to zoom in on, any communities communities you work in. And we hope you'll, take this information, look at it in your area, and hopefully it'll be useful to you. I thought, though, since we have, a couple MVAs, might be interesting to hone in on a couple places and just look at how the markets have changed over time. So I picked just two of the sort of complete communities. When we send you this presentation after this, we'll make sure you've got the sort of maps of all the complete communities. But I just picked two to kind of look at how things have changed since the last MVA. So this is a zoom in on the Acres Home neighborhood. And this is the MVA from 2016. So you can see back in 2016, Acres Home, had kind of a mix of weaker H and G and F markets. To the south, we had, just you can see just on the bottom here, just a little bit of kind of blue C markets, so sort of those upper middle markets. Here's what that community looks. Is there a question?
Yeah, Jacob, I just want to make sure we address questions kind of as we go,
Sure.
Before we go into complete communities.
Yeah.
Hi, this is Renee Martinez. I'm with the Harris County Community Services Department. Part of our role is also serving as administrator of the Harris County Redevelopment Authority and the Tax Increment Reinvestment Zone program for the county. So we have a zone that's called Zone 24 that includes the eastern half of the CBD, the area north of U of H main campus, bounded by Scott, Cullen, Leland, and then also a large area that we're currently undergoing a comprehensive engineering study for, which is the area south of Texas Medical Center, the NRG, and then a very large area south of the Loop. We have approximately 4,000 undeveloped or underdeveloped acres there. Primary reason it's undeveloped is because the city hasn't really, they didn't even install infrastructure in some major thoroughfares that were installed. So we're going in and creating the environment for redevelopment. But there is a question in all of this, because I don't know, maybe I missed it. Did you all track any subdivision plat activity that's an indicator of future development? Because I would argue that there's an alternative reality to this whole area south of the Loop, particularly in light of the fact, because we're currently working with Texas Medical Center on an agreement relative to their project. It's going to be very catalytic. There's
Mhm.
all kinds of planning activity out here, and I'm just not. Maybe y'all focus just on existing housing, but I think, yeah, I'd like to hear. Did you consider
Yeah.
planning activity and future indicators of development?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that sounds like that is some really great data. One of the things, so the short
I mean,
answer
it
is it
exists,
didn't get
and the planning
incorporated.
department has it.
Yeah, exactly. So the short answer is we didn't incorporate that into this model. But I think that's exactly the kind of information that would be great to overlay with the model. And let me explain why. So when we're looking for indicators in the MVA, because of the sort of statistical model we use to identify these typologies, each indicator has to be kind of present across the city. So in areas that are fully developed and areas that aren't developed yet. So plotting the plotting activity you're describing would be really interesting to incorporate. And I think that's something we should look at in the future, but it would be challenging to include because there are areas where they're fully built out and it's going to have a lot of zero values. That said, I think that's the kind of information that we'll get to this in a second, but there are certain parts of the city where we expect to see more development based on kind of past trends or some of the other indicators we looked at. And so identifying places that are having, plat development or could have plat development would be a really helpful predictor of kind of future trends and maybe where we want to kind of direct investments within some of these market types.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's what clearly is missing to me. And I don't know if you've looked at areas that just have not had infrastructure investment as well that prohibit development. And did you go beyond the city limits just to even look at some of the ETJ would be the last question. So anyway, I'll pause there.
Yeah.
So if I can just chime in briefly so everyone would know, this is a base map, and we used it as a base map in 2013 and the previous year. We used it to look for causal factors of why there were blue markets, why they were salmon markets or gold markets. But one of the things that we like about this being a base map, it allows us to go add some of the data that the planning department has, and we can go into subdivisions and take a deep dive and look for causal factors or even find solutions if our solutions for different types of housings or areas that we can integrate and implement different kinds of housing. So I want everyone to know that this is a base map and we can add data, and when we share it, we'll be looking for you all to start asking, even if you want to do any kind of analytics, to add those analytics where we can put it where you can actually select and share with the whole community as to kind of what's going on in these subdivisions as we get down to more granular levels like subdivisions. So Renee, thank you for that question, because that allows me to say, hey, this is why we have this base map, to be able to add data and do so everybody can do their own different types of analyses.
Doc, this is Curtis. I'd like to add one other point to that. Renee, I think your questions are spot on. I think the question of market drivers versus market indicators in terms of the data and how to use the data to understand the dynamics that are going on in the city, the kinds of questions that you asked help reveal that. That is, when someone does a plat, when and how is that reflected in the market? Most of the MVA is focused on retrospective activity. That is, sales that have happened and indicators that are things that have happened. And I think that layering that Doc is talking about and how this might be useful is as one does analysis to look at things that one can anticipate used to drive a market in particular direction, this becomes a very good base from which to do these kinds of sensitivity analysis. So I think the questions are great, and the layering effect could be very powerful.
And did we answer the distress question for you, Renee? Yeah, I know Emily.
Not real. No, not really, because I mean, what I was focusing on was this large area bounded by 288 to the east, roughly 610 to the north, Maine to the west. And I mean, I'm seeing areas here that I would consider everything but distress. And part of it is, and I think it's the predictor of future activity. I mean, we're seeing all kinds of land plays, land prices completely escalating. Now it's going to be driven significantly by this large TMC, and we want to get ahead of the curve on having a very housing centric, mixed income, mixed development approach. And this is something I'd like to even share with with my board, and then also in the work that we're doing with TMC. But I guess I'm just seeing a little bit of a different reality than what's here.
And can I? Yeah, so I would also just add that in the context of Houston, distress is very relative, and distress might be the wrong term we're just using right now. And you'll see, Doc mentioned those salmon-colored markets, and we don't even have any salmon-colored markets anymore because even the lower-priced markets have improved so much and strengthened in Houston over the last few years. That we sort of cut out that most bottom, typically distressed, high foreclosure, high code violation type of market, because even the lowest price markets have appreciated a lot and have signs of strength. And so I think that's sort of one aspect of it. It's that, those markets compared to the purples and the blues, their prices and their appreciation is not quite as extreme. But we also have a measure coming up we're going to talk about called our displacement risk ratio that looks at changing sale prices over time compared to income at a fixed point in time. It's sort of a way of thinking about gentrification or other types of change along those lines. And I think there you'll see a lot of things popping up on the east side in those orange areas. But you'll see that that measure allows us to capture some of the dynamic of change that adds to the MBA's snapshot of a point in time.
Yeah, that's a great point, Emily. This is all relative to the city of Houston, right? So, we're doing an MVA right now in Jacksonville, and they're stronger markets. Well, they have some pretty strong markets, but what's distressed there is not the same as what's distressed here, and what's distressed here is not. So really, we should be saying stronger or weaker, because objectively, compared to a lot of the places we work, even those H&I markets are pretty strong and appreciating pretty quickly here in Houston. So thanks for making that tweak on the language. Do we have any other questions before we jump on? This is great. I don't want to cut off the conversation. We also have a couple other things to show you. Cool. Let me jump ahead. Please keep putting your questions in the chat. And we'll pause in a couple minutes and ask a couple more questions. So I was just going through and showing you a couple sort of changes over time. So we talked about Acres Home. Again, you can observe the strengthening of the market there. This is near North Side, and again, this is the near North Side as it was classified in the 2016 MVA. So you can see, to the west, we have these sort of stronger markets. Again, we had these stronger markets, and, we had this sort of border of I-45. And then to the east, near the north side was kind of this, liminal space between these two stronger and weaker markets to the east. And this is that same area, classified today. So we can see, those stronger markets to the west, if I'm doing my geography correctly, have kind of moved east, right? And this weaker markets that were over here have also improved. And so near north side, classifications have really changed. So again, just kind of highlighting where we've seen, markets improve and decline. I'm just going to go quickly through this, but just wanted to point out, just one kind of interesting factoid. When we share this information with you, again, there's lots of other information we've got summarized here about who lives in these different markets, what are the conditions there, but just thought it was interesting to look at the sort of racial and ethnic composition of these different markets. you know, like we see in many cities, you know, there's a historical legacy that informs a lot of this. You know, the strongest markets in the city, like we see in many cities, are you know, predominantly white in terms of who lives there. Weaker markets have, you know, more Black and brown residents. But just thought it was interesting to point out these sort of middle markets in the city, you know, D, E, and F, really are the most diverse places in the city as well. So these are places where, you know, you've got roughly the sort of city average composition of white, Black, Asian, Hispanic residents. That's something we've observed in a number of cities. These middle markets, you know, tend to not only have kind of average prices and affordable prices, but also the kind of you know, diversity that, you know, I think we want to see in our cities. So let me pause again before we turn it back over to Brett and Working Partner to talk about the economic development investment analysis. Are there other questions from the group? I can't see the chat anymore, so I'm kind of missing that.
There was a question about the participation. Doc, you're a bit more familiar with the list of all the invitees to these groups. Was there anybody from ULI invited or the Apartment Association?
No, but that does not mean that we can't connect with them for further input in the future and towards the next MVA. But no, they were not included. We kept the local stakeholder group kind of small because they were in person, and today is more just virtual. But no, they were not, Renee. But I do see where they could have some input in this easily.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the reason I brought that up is just based on, you know, people, you know, the development community, others, and what their reaction would be to these, you know, these different characterizations of areas. Also, you know, what's labeled distressed versus, you know, if you want to call it high opportunity.
Well, that's just it. We have been careful over the years as to not label them, to only label them by lettering and colors, to let people have their own interpretation of what these areas actually are. So even though they're talking in descriptive terms about more distressed, using adjectives, it's the overall end result will not be labeling at all. We've been very careful since the beginning not to label these neighborhoods, only by colors, and to allow other folks to make their own interpretations and do their own follow-up analyses. I think Maddie has a question or a comment.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, I think tracking neighborhood diversity over time is important, because often what we'll see in terms of, you know, gentrification or as, you know, as neighborhoods go from affordable to less affordable, is that diversity is sort of a stopping point, and what you're ending up with is neighborhoods that are resegregated. They're just resegregated as all white versus communities of color.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think speaks to some of the, you know, some of the things maybe there's policy interventions or investments we could make to kind of help lock in, you know, affordability, or, you know, help people stay in their homes, and maybe could help us kind of freeze the frame where things are now, which is nice. But yeah, that's a great point, Sloan.
Yeah, and I think Maddie's been a part of this since 2013. Is that right, Maddie? Maddie?
Sorry, I can't find my
yeah.
button.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, and she made a good point, and I want to speak to all again here, is that the point is to have this data over time and to be able to tweak it. So any input from you all, and any input that we may have missed as a local stakeholder, that input's going to be very important as we move forward in the next 3 years, because I'm assuming there's going to be some changes. Because if you look at it, and I've been looking at it, our city is changing a lot. So thank you for the overtime and the longitudinal, as relates to longitudinal assessment, Maddie, because that's exactly what we're trying to do, is to keep an eye on what's happening in these particular areas.
Let's take one more question, then Brett, I promise we'll pass it over to you. I see there's two great questions in the chat here. Please keep these coming, and, you know, we'll keep answering them in the chat, and you know, try to answer them in text as well. But just a quick point on someone was asking, you know, about the number of renters in each market. And I'll just say this is something that actually is pretty typical. You know, when we do these MVAs in cities around the country, is often we'll see kind of a pairing of markets, you know, where you've got a strong predominantly renter market and a strong predominantly homeowner market, often with similar prices. And I think that kind of reflects the fact that, right now there's a lot of people who kind of rent by choice. We often think of renters as like people who aspire to become owners, but there are people, because of life phase or other circumstances are renting by choice. And I think that's what we're seeing in those sort of purple, stronger rental markets. I will say what did interesting about Houston is you see those pairings of renter owner markets kind of across the price spectrum in the city, which we don't typically see. So that is kind of an interesting Houston wrinkle. Okay, Brett, let me turn it over to you to talk about the economic development analysis. We'll come back to some of the MVA stuff, and this is a great conversation, so really looking forward to continuing this.
Yes, thank you, Jacob. Yeah, great conversation so far, and I hope that we add to it here with a little bit of a switching up of what we're talking about, right? So it's been focused on housing so far, and what I'm going to be talking about is the economic development investment study. So I just want to say good morning. My name is Brett Sinclair. I'm a data analyst with Working Partner, which is a local strategy and evaluation firm here in Houston. And we performed this economic development investment study, which we refer to as the EDI, as an update of an analysis that was performed in 2016 as part of the MVA effort. So this is an update from the data from 2016 up to 2020 information, which is the latest data set that was available to us. And so, as I mentioned, the EDI analysis is concerned more with private business investment and analyzing the changes over time in that investment. And it's intended to support the MVA, understanding kind of the dynamics of what's going on in investment so that you can leverage those things going forward. So going back to what was mentioned at the beginning about the normative assumption is that, there's importance, we have to be able to leverage private investment. So this analysis really is intended to provide some information about where private investment has been strong, where businesses are moving in, and what industries are changing, how things are changing as far as the industries that are coming into our area or leaving the area.
Brett,
so that's what we're going to get into.
I'm sorry, Brett. Could you make your screen larger to get the full effect of the PowerPoint at the bottom? Thanks.
It's up. Okay.
I think we're seeing did you put it into presentation?
Yeah. Hit that button down there to make it. No, to the lower right. There's a thing that looks like a little film thing that you can click to make the whole.
I did. Okay.
Oh, I think you're sharing the wrong screen then. We're seeing your actual slide presentation.
Here, let me go back.
Thanks.
This worked when we tried it this morning. Of course, it's not working now. All right, let me just share the whole screen and see if that's better. Maybe that'll work.
There we go.
There we go. Thank you.
Can you see it now? Okay,
Yeah.
good. So the problem was that I was actually on the PowerPoint itself. Anyway, so we can go forward. So today, the overview of what we're going to talk about. I mentioned kind of what we're going to talk about, but we presented this throughout in the stakeholder meetings previously, and so we're going to talk about the highlights from those previous analyses where we're looking at the commercial corridors, which are going to be TERS areas specifically, and we'll talk a little bit about that, but we don't want to spend all the time on that because in one of the sessions that we were in, we received a recommendation to look more deeply at the complete communities, right? So I guess there's some activity going on in the complete communities around economic development, and so they wanted us to look at that. So we have a new analysis for the complete communities that we're going to be digging into today. And then we're going to wrap it up by looking at a detailed analysis of the commercial corridors. And so this will allow us to see in detail on top of the MVA map. So this is one of those overlays that is possible, where businesses are coming in, where businesses exist, and where businesses might be leaving as far as if they experience a death or moved out of the area and that sort of thing. And so just as a background, again, the data that we use to conduct this analysis is the National Establishment Time Series database, which is the NETS database. And so we refer to that, it's from Walls & Associates, and it compiles historical Dun & Bradstreet information into snapshots into a time series. And so this actually is a very robust database. It has over 30 years of information at this point for businesses in all around the country, right? And so, the data from here is normally collected primarily through telephone calls. it's updated every single year. So they're calling people to make sure that they're still in business and what size of their business, that sort of thing. And then there's also use of additional data sources if they're not able to locate that business or not able to get in touch with them. Something like the Yellow Pages, public records, government registries, and things of that nature. And, to our knowledge, it's the only available longitudinal data source with business establishments and point level geographies. And, it also includes those industry classifications, which are important for this analysis. So with every database, every data system, there's challenges, there's some limitations and things that make it a little bit difficult to move forward with some of the data. And so there's a cleaning process that has to take place. But, one of the challenges is the employment information. Some people don't report that. And so there is a little bit of estimation that has to take place when they're compiling the information for this database. There's also, some locations. So they give us latitude and longitude, but sometimes, the location information isn't exact. So they might be at a zip code centroid or a census tract centroid. And so we try to clean that up by looking at address and making sure that they're in the right place, or making sure that the address has no typos and there's no ambiguous addresses, or they're not missing, and those sort of things. And then lastly, there's a slight time lag in capturing opening and closures. So, this data is collected at the beginning of every year. And so, when you're looking at data from 2014, let's say, if a business opened in 2014, you may not have all the information for that business in 2014, which is difficult to include them in the counts for that current year. And the reason for that is they won't capture that information until they do it the next year. This also has some implications for COVID, right? So we're looking at 2020 information, but it's from the beginning of 2020. So capturing COVID is a little bit difficult when we look at the data set that we're using for this analysis. Okay, so I wanted to start off, giving a little background. I know most people have been in some sessions before, but you may have missed it. And also, this is just a good refresher, because we're going to be talking about the commercial corridors when we get into the detailed analysis at the end. So just wanted to provide a little bit of a refresher on the commercial corridor analysis that we presented on last time. And so this is a map of the commercial corridors. There's 20 in total that we looked at. And most of these, you'll notice, are TERS areas. So tax increment reinvestment zone areas. The lone exception here is Acres Homes, which I believe is a super neighborhood area at the time. And the other thing that's important to point out here is that, these are 2016 shapes that we're looking at. So they may have been updated since then, but the reason we wanted to use 2016 shapes is so that we could have an apples to apples comparison of the update from the last study to this study. And so that's really what we're looking at here. I'm not going to go into all the details on each one, but we are going to touch on some of the detailed corridors for a couple of them. Again, Jacob mentioned you're going to get these slides, so you'll be able to dig in as much as you feel necessary at a later time. And so really, as we look through these highlights, the main theme that we're going to see that will emerge here is that there's been a considerable amount of growth, economic growth in Houston from 2014 to 2020, right? So the number of establishments have increased, the number of the amount of employment has increased. And so right now what we're looking at is the change in the number of establishments from 2014 through 2020. And you can see in City of Houston, the increase was actually 20%. So there's been considerable growth across the City of Houston when looking at the number of establishments over time. And you look specifically at the corridors, so all 20 of them, and most, I think it's 12 of the corridors, saw an increase of higher than 20%, so higher than what we see around the city. So those TERS areas are seeing a more increase comparative to the city as a whole. And notably, there's a couple of things here. So we didn't show the previous slide, which shows the amount of establishments in each one, but two of the largest areas are Uptown and Southwest Houston, and they have a lot higher number of establishments compared to many of these areas. And even there, you see a huge increase. So percentages are relative. So when we see a 27% increase in Southwest Houston that has a really high number of establishments, that's a very large increase that we're seeing there. And there was only one corridor that had a decrease, but it's very slight. And we're looking at Fifth Ward would be the only one that had a decrease in the number of establishments. So going from establishments, now looking at employment. So these are the amount of people that are employed by those establishments that we looked at earlier, and looking at change over time. So, the theme continues. So there was a lot of growth, but the growth is less drastic. So the magnitude of change looking at employment is less drastic compared to what we see when we look at the number of establishments, right? So overall, the employment in Houston remained relatively flat. So we only see a 4% increase. So a 20% increase in the establishments, but only 4% increase in the employment across the city of Houston. But like we saw earlier, most of the corridors actually have a higher percentage increase over time in employment. And so, there's a couple of things to consider here. I mentioned it's relative. So Leland Woods, you see as the one with the highest increase in employment, but there that area is very small. And so there's only 19 jobs in that corridor total from what we see in the NETS database. And so that 46% increase is a lot less than what you would see somewhere in Midtown, or if you're talking about, Uptown and Southwest Houston, who are the largest corridors when we're talking about those. Employment decline in 3 corridors. Fifth Ward, which is, we did see a decrease in establishments, so that makes sense. Greenspoint and Uptown. So Uptown had a really large increase in the number of businesses, but actually decline in the number of employment, right, in their employment level. And so, the reason for that, what we're going to get to in the next slide, which is, a lot of the people that are coming in. So this is looking at, the total bursts, so the new businesses that are being put into the corridors, and what's the size of the employer, so the size of the business, and you can see that most of the businesses are small businesses, so they're going to be less than 5 employees, and actually 52% of them have either 1 or 2 employees, so very small businesses, and so that accounts for that increase. So you could see one big business might leave. And then we have a big influx of new businesses, but they're all very small. And so that can account for the decrease that we see in some of the corridors comparative to the decrease in employment comparative to the increase in establishments, right? So just adding a little bit of context to that. And the other piece of this, so we look at the change in establishments, we look at the change in employment, but also we wanted to understand a little bit more about the industry groups. So what industries are changing in Houston? Is there increase in those industries, decrease in those sort of things? So we're looking at employment in this case. And, from 2014 to 2020, we did see an increase across most of the industries. The largest industry by far is services, and also saw the largest increase. And so services is kind of a broad category. It includes, hotel, personal services, business services, auto repair, movies. So it's a pretty broad category, and most of the employment happens in the service category. Retail trade is the next largest, and also saw a considerable increase from 2014 to 2020. And when we're talking about increase in that area, it's really going to be eating places and food stores are where we saw the most considerable increase in retail trade, right? And so when we look across all of these, most of them stayed relatively steady, but as I said, slight increases in most categories. The only one that saw a dip was manufacturing. And so this is kind of a summary of what I just looked at. Services are the top one, followed by retail trade, manufacturing, finance and insurance, and real estate, and then transportation and public utilities. And breaking it down a little bit further, when we look into the service industry, one of the highest sub-services or, sub-industries, that are inside the service industry. And where employment is largely concentrated is going to be in business services, health services, this engineering, accounting, research, and management. So a lot of, research stuff that's going on there, and then educational services. So those are where, when we talk about services, these are the areas where most of the employment is taking place. And then I mentioned the one major industry group saw a decline from 2014 to 2020, and that's manufacturing. But the decline was not a very large decline. It's relatively small. Honing in on those specific TERS corridors, we look at the industries in those corridors. Services is the largest industry in 19 out of 20 of them. And that's actually up from 75% in the previous study. So in 2016, it was roughly 3/4. that were had service as their top industry. So there has been a big boost in the service industry in most of the corridors, right? Sunnyside is the only corridor with a different top industry, and that's focused on manufacturing, or concentrated in manufacturing. The second largest industry is going to be retail trade. We already saw that in the overall across the city of Houston. That trend holds for the corridors. And then there's a few specific corridors. So Uptown and Fourth Ward have a considerable amount of finance. Market Square and Leland Woods have a little bit of a more focus on transportation. Acres Homes, we had some construction coming into play there. And then Fifth Ward, manufacturing, and Hardy and near Northside has wholesale trade inside that TERS area. So, people that are distributing to retailers and things of that nature. Yeah, so we already talked about services and retail being the biggest. Okay, so that's a quick overview of what we saw in the last one. So looking at the TERS areas, those commercial corridors that we ran the analysis on last time. And so now we're going to talk about, these complete communities and the analysis that we completed for that. It's going to be very similar, but we're going to be focusing on different areas in this case. So we know that there's more than 10 complete communities, but these are 10 of the complete communities that were identified by the city of Houston to include in the analysis. It can be a bit confusing because some of the names in the corridors match up to the names in the complete communities. So I wanted to show you kind of a map on the map where there's some overlap, as well as, the complete communities are going to be those brighter shades. And then you look at anything that's light pink. Those are the areas that we looked at in the commercial corridor analysis, which are the TERS areas. So there is considerable overlap. So a lot of what we talked about in the TERS areas is going to hold true for the complete communities. But then there's certain areas like Sunnyside that encompasses quite a bit more. And then the A-Leaf neighborhood is somewhat new. So it has some overlap with Southwest, but it pushes out a little bit further to the Southwest comparatively. And then near Northside is going to be a much larger area compared to the TERS area, which is very small. Okay, so looking at establishments and employment. The number of establishments, overall, most communities have fewer than 2,000 establishments overall, and most hovering around 1,000. But you can see A-Leaf and Gulfton are going to be by far the largest, right? So A-Leaf is a large area, but also it's located in Southwest Houston, which is a very densely populated area. Same thing with Gulfton, right? So both of those are in Southwest Houston and very densely populated areas around them. So it makes sense that there might be more businesses in those areas. When we look at change in the number of establishments, so we saw in the TERS areas how large the change was in some cases. I think, East Downtown was something around 86%. So we did see, considerable growth in these complete communities areas, but it's less. It's a little bit more moderated compared to what we saw in the TERS areas, right? So most are actually less than the city of Houston overall, under that 20% threshold. But you do see Gulfton had an 18% increase. Second Ward and Third Ward had the largest increases. So Second Ward at 24% and Third Ward at 33% have the largest growth in the number of establishments from 2014 to 2020. Second Ward, of course, is along the east side of town, so on the east end, close to Buffalo Bayou, which can make some sense, closer to the port than other areas. And then Third Ward is South Central Houston. So there's a lot of development going on around there, a lot of businesses moving into the Third Ward area, which has been kind of a trendy area in recent years. 3 communities, Cashmere Gardens, Fort Bend, Houston, and Acres Home saw a decline, but it's very small. So we're talking about 3 to 4% for all of those areas that declined in the number of establishments. Looking at employment, the trend is very similar, right? So we see A-Leaf and Gulfton as the largest in terms of employment. A-Leaf over 60,000 jobs and Gulfton has over 20,000 jobs. But overall, most hover around that 10,000 mark. So most are underneath 10,000 slightly. There's Third Ward, Sunnyside, and Acres Homes have slightly above 10,000. And looking at change, so we saw across city of Houston, it was relatively steady in terms of change, and we see that trend continue for most of these complete communities, right? And so most of the change is under 10%. But we do see, Fort Bend, Houston, Sunnyside, Acres Homes, and Second Ward have a slightly more increase. Second Ward has the largest increase as far as the number in employment, right? The change in employment from 2014 to 2020. And one thing that I want to point out here, is Third Ward, we see this big decrease, minus 23%. That's kind of a weird thing with the data itself, right? So something happened with the school system. So Third Ward has U of H in it and also TSU. And from 2014 to 2020, we saw a big decrease in the number in employment in those two places, which accounts for why Third Ward saw this large decrease in employment as compared to their large increase in the number of businesses, right? So, that was really a factor of those two establishments, the U of H and TSU. And so when we talk about where increases in employment happen, most of it's in the service industry. So Second Ward, you're talking about service industry and manufacturing. It's closer to the Port of Houston, as I mentioned. Acres Homes, retail and construction. So we saw a good deal of construction coming into the Acres Homes area as far as employment's concerned. And then Sunnyside and Fort Bend, where we see, an increase of over 15%. Those are going to be services and retail for the most part. That's where the increase is concentrated. So this is a repeat of the chart that we did earlier. So we wanted to understand a little bit more about who's coming in, what businesses are coming into the area and what the size is, to add a little bit more context to understand why we see such big increases in the number of establishments and kind of smaller increases in the number of employment. And it's the same trend. So 89% of new businesses are small businesses with under 5 employees, and most are going to be with 1 or 2 employees. Looking into the industries now in the complete communities, the largest industry in all 10 is going to be the service industry. I mentioned this is, a very broad category. So, there's been a lot of growth in that across the city of Houston. And so it stands that, the service industry is really where most employment is concentrated in the complete community areas. Beyond services, you're looking at retail, trade and manufacturing, having a strong presence in these communities. Retail is particularly strong in Fort Bend, Gulfton, Magnolia Park, and near Northside, while manufacturing has a decent share of employment in Second Ward and Sunnyside. And so this chart, this table is going to give you a little bit more context as to where people are falling and what, these are the top 3 largest industries by employment and all the complete communities. And then you can also see we provided their share of total employment for that industry. And obviously services is number 1 and across all of them. Some of them have considerably high share. So if you look at Third Ward, 80% of all of their employment is in the service industry, right? So that's very high. Then we look at, the number 2 thing, retail trade is the highest in most, but you see Second Ward, Cashmere Gardens, and Sunnyside having a good deal of manufacturing in those areas. And then we get a mix in number 3, right? But it is important. So I wanted to look at this last measure here, the cumulative share of the top 3. So this measure really is helping us to assess the diversity of the industries within each corridor, right? So when you add up all 3 of the top 3, the share of the top 3 industries, you get to this number. And any number that's really high means that there's a lack of diversity inside that complete community, right? Lack of diversity in terms of industry. So you can see Third Ward's at 95%. So most of the employment is tied up within those 3 industries that are mentioned in the top. And then you look at something like Sunnyside and Magnolia Park, where the cumulative share is at 69%, so much lower than we see in Third Ward. And these are areas that have more diverse industries. So not everything is concentrated in the top 3. There are other industries at play in these communities. And then lastly here, we like to consider the business turnover. So in tracking business turnover, we consider the data for the years 2014 and 2020 as two separate snapshots in time. So, if there's a change from 2014 to 2020, if a business was to start, if a business ended, or if there's, an address change, we would classify the business into one of four categories. So if a birth is, which we mentioned a little bit earlier, is a business that appeared in the NETS database in 2020, but was not around in 2014. So it wasn't there in 2014. A move-in is going to be a business that's outside a particular geography of interest. In this case, it's either corridors or the complete communities. But then by 2020, they had moved into that geography. So they had a change of address, and the new address is inside the corridor that we're looking at. A death is going to be a business that was in the NETS database in 2014, but did not exist in 2020, or they have an end date before 2020. And a move out is going to be the opposite of the move in, right? So a business was in the particular geography in 2014, and by 2020, they had moved out of that geography. And so from there, we take those classifications and measure the inflow and outflow of the businesses. So inflow being burst, so business being born, or a startup, and then a plus move in and put it over the unique businesses. So we get a percentage of the total unique businesses in the area that are coming into the region. And then outflow is the opposite. So we're looking at death and move out over the number of unique establishments. And comparing the inflow and outflow can be a good measure to understand the economic activity and provide information about where resources are being allocated within a geography. So you can see where and what industries, investment is being made, or where maybe people are pulling back, and in what industries people are pulling back around Houston. So something about turnover, it can be kind of shocking at times. There can be a lot of turnover, but a lot of turnover isn't always a sign that it's something bad, right? So it could be that the corridor is adapting, so there's some churn happening. Business moves out, business moves in, or they're changing a changing economic landscape, and it's being adaptable to that. So, one indicator that you want to look at that would be something of a red flag would be if there's rapid turnover constantly, or long-term vacancy. So you see a lot of move outs or a lot of deaths in a certain area, and they're not filled back in by new businesses. So here's a snapshot of the inflow and outflow by establishments, and this is by the complete communities, right? And so you can see this kind of aligns very closely to the change in establishments that we looked at from 2014 to 2020. So most corridors are going to have larger inflow than they are outflow, but you see most are actually below the city of Houston average, right? So across city of Houston, we see a lot more inflow than outflow. And so most of them have less difference between the inflow and outflow than the city of Houston. But we see second ward and third ward with far more inflow than outflow. So they have a lot of businesses coming in and fewer businesses going out. So to summarize that, 7 out of 10 of the complete communities had an inflow rate that outpaced the outflow, right? And inflow is largely driven by the service and retail industry. So we mentioned how much those are growing, service and retail. And really when we do the analysis looking at who's coming in and who's going out, services and retail are the two industries coming in at the highest rate. So the inflow rate is much higher for those industries as compared to others. Areas with considerable inflow, in other industries. So finance had some inflow in A-Leaf, Gulfton, near North Side and Third Ward. And then transportation and utilities was an area where we saw a good number of inflow in Acres Homes, A-Leaf, and Gulfton. And 3 of the communities that we saw had a kind of an outflow that outpaced their inflow. So they had more businesses leaving than businesses coming in. When we looked at the outflow, actually, it was driven by services and retail again. So that stands to say there's so much of those compared to other industries. And so when we see the outflow actually was driven by those two as well. And then this is just a detailed table, which you'll be able to look at in more detail. I'm not going to go through line by line to show the number of firms in each year, in each complete community, but the information is here, and you can definitely use that in the future. Okay. So I don't know if there's any questions. I can't see the chat at all. I got two screens going on here. But if there's questions, go ahead and let me know, Jacob. I know I'm running through pretty quick.
No, you're good. I think we've answered most of the questions that have come up, but there was a question about, whether or not we have information about the impact of COVID.
Oh, yeah.
And
Yeah.
whether we could look at wage levels to understand, are these good jobs that are coming or going, or
right. Yeah, so as far as I've seen, Jacob, the NETS database doesn't have wage information on there, but there are some other places we can look. So we did do an analysis of higher wage job centers and lower wage job centers, and we created some maps about that. But it won't necessarily be tied to each specific corridor. It would be mostly across the city of Houston. And as far as COVID's concerned, the time lag is going to be the issue with COVID, right? So it would be interesting to understand that, but we're looking at 2020, and because of the way that Walls and Associates do their data collection, it mostly happens at the beginning of the year. So you're talking about early 2020 before the effects of the pandemic really hit, right? So we're kind of missing that. That's a missing piece, is understanding what happened during COVID in this analysis. Okay.
Brett, this is Curtis. I'm assuming healthcare is included in services, and
yes.
does not give us any idea of what percentage of healthcare. I would think healthcare would be the fat man on the waterbed of services.
Actually, yeah. So health is like the second largest, I think. I think business services is the highest. So business services is kind of an interesting category. So that includes advertising, credit reporting, collection of claims, mailing, those sort of things, and news syndicates and stuff like that. So that's actually was the highest in terms of service. But yeah, health is definitely up there.
The reason I highlighted that is the same as the impact of universities on employment. That universities and the healthcare industry tend to move in herds, if you will, in terms of their economic impacts, and that might be something good to pay attention to as it relates to employment in neighborhoods, because they are anchor institutions and they have anchor institution effects in those neighborhoods.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. If you get around the medical center, somewhat in downtown, there's a lot of employment in the health service industry, which we'll be able to see a little bit of that in the maps that are coming up. Okay. So if there's no other questions right now, we can move on to this detailed analysis of the commercial corridors. Sorry, I see somebody unmuted. Did somebody?
Yes, this is Shannon Buggs. Thank you so much. I really appreciated seeing the analysis on the complete communities and being able to get more insight about impact between 2016 and 2020. So that's really fantastic. And I look forward to diving further into the data, but thank you.
Great. Well, I'm glad that it was useful. I hope that you guys get good use out of it going forward. Great. So let's move on now to the detailed analysis of the commercial corridors. We created detailed snapshots for each of the commercial corridors. So this is going back to those TERS areas that we were talking about earlier. And it describes the change in each corridor from 2014 to 2020, identifies top industries and those sort of things in more detail. So top industries, it's looking more at the micro level. So not necessarily the major industry, but maybe sub-industries underneath. Also, the maps help illustrate, where businesses are in each corridor, how they're distributed, and density. We also map turnover. So, looking at the MVA, we did use it as a base map in this case and mapped business turnover on top of it, which allows us to understand a little bit more context about why we might see some changes in the market, right? Based on economic investment. In the interest of time, we've included, I think 3 examples, but we do have all 20 available, all 20 corridors available. If this is of interest, and you guys can definitely dig into that moving forward. Right. So this first slide is just to say the reason that this type of analysis is important, is that there is a relationship that exists between housing and commercial activity. So there is evidence to suggest that, a strong housing market can attract more businesses to the area, and a vibrant commercial corridor can also attract residents into those surrounding neighborhoods, and vice versa, right? So a weaker commercial corridor is less attractive to investors. So you might not have as much housing development in that area. So it is important to understand this relationship, and some of the data that we're going to be presenting can be used to understand that relationship a little bit better. So the first example that we have here is Acres Homes. And so I just want to say, I'm going to explain the chart a little bit. So in these first slides, they're going to be more detailed profile about the corridor. And, answer on the right, you see this table, which answers the type of questions about what industries make up the corridor. Are they growing or decreasing? Is the corridor made up of small firms, or what does the makeup look like? And is there a sizable amount of medium firms or large firms? So it's really answering those type of descriptive questions. And then the map on the left side is going to show you exactly where those businesses are located. And you'll notice there's a color coding system. So the blue businesses are going to be one specific business in that location. And then going up, green is going to be 2 to 5 businesses, red is 6 to 10, that kind of brown is 11 to 20. And then the pink is going to be greater than 20. And so this allows us to understand the distribution and density in the area. Plus, there are some areas with very tall buildings that have multiple businesses within each one. And so we wanted to identify where those are by aggregating this information and telling you there's this many businesses in one location. It also helps to understand if there's specific, commercial centers within each area, right? And so going into that, you see Acres Homes. The businesses are pretty dispersed. So, there's not a whole lot of large business centers. A lot of them are single businesses across the area. We did see when we look at the table here, the establishments are relatively steady. So not a whole lot of change in the number of establishments. Employment did increase by about 700. And then when we look at the industries, educational services is the highest, the industry with the most employment. But it did see a slight decrease in that from 2014 to 2020. But the biggest increase that you see is in construction, right? So 30 up to 1,032 in terms of employment. And in digging more deeply into this is really driven by one specific business that moved into the area and had a high number of employees. So I think they had about 1,000 employees, and they were outside of the area before and moved into Acres Homes. So that's really the driver of that change. And then if you look at firms by employment size, most are going to be small businesses. There's not a whole lot of medium-sized businesses or large businesses in this area. And looking at business turnover mapped on top of the MVA. So this is the 2022 MVA that Jacob just went over. And the MVA shows that Acres Home is mostly comprised of those weaker or middle markets, right? So you get that E, and then also below that into the orange and yellows, right? So I just want to point out on here too. So the pink circles in this case are going to be places where there's been a closing. So either a death or a move out from 2014 to 2020. And then the blue squares underneath are going to be where we saw a birth or a move in. So when you look at the blue squares, you look at the pink squares on top of a blue square, means that there's been churning happening there. So you had a move out or a death followed by a birth or a move in. So that's that churning effect that I talked about. When you look at other areas of interest, might be areas where you see, a cluster of blue squares. That's going to be where people moved in, or a cluster of pink squares is going to be where there's been a lot of business death that hasn't been replaced yet, right? And so when we look at, Acres Homes itself, it seems like there's a lot of where there's been a death, there's also been a move in, but there are specific pockets where you see kind of, especially in the markets that are a little bit more middling markets, you see more concentrations of people that are moving in, but not as much death, right? So you see these cluster of bursts here in these in this area where there's actually middle markets, right, in the E market. And then we talk about turnover. There's a lot of death up here, a lot of business death and business move out up toward the more weaker markets, right? East Downtown, we wanted to put this one in here because it's pretty interesting. So East Downtown was one that saw the largest amount of growth. So we do know, you know, we saw the number of establishments go from 319 to 585, so nearly double. There was a good amount of growth there as far as the number of businesses. But then you look at who's moving in. Eating and drinking places are really the main driver of who's moving in here, as well as business services, right? And so eating and drinking places is interesting. As I mentioned, it's difficult to capture the impact of COVID here. And so this is something that may have changed over time, right? Especially because COVID, we know, hit retail and especially eating and drinking places so hard. So there could be some change in the impact, an impact on what happened as far as employment in East Downtown. Although it is a thriving neighborhood, it's been developing rapidly. So I'm not sure if it'd be interesting to see what the impact actually was. And then the breakdown of firms by employment size, most are small businesses, but here you do see an increase in the number of kind of medium businesses. So those with employment 5 to 49. And also here, if you look at the map itself, you'll see a lot of areas where there's a little bit more either large complexes for businesses to be in or business centers. I'm guessing some of these are large buildings which multiple business live, but you see far less as far as, you know, just single businesses hanging out on their own, right? So most of them are kind of clustered together. I'm looking at business turnover. You can see that all of this East Downtown sits in the D market. So a little bit more on the higher end, well, kind of middle. It's not the high purple color, but on the higher end of the blue level, right? And you can see, especially areas in the northern side of East Downtown and also in the southern area here, there's lots of areas where there's clusters of businesses moving in and not so much moving out. So a lot of development happening. And not people leaving the area, right? And whenever we do see somebody leaving, it's usually replaced by somebody else. So there's a churning there. So businesses move in to the area that's vacated by somebody else. And then the last one we wanted to show you here was Greater Houston, which is a little bit of a funky shape, right? So it encompasses a lot of that area that we were talking about earlier when Renee was talking about down south, just east of 288. And also it goes up toward the southern portion of the medical center, right? So the northern area on this map is going to be very close to the medical center, and that's where we see a lot of business development happening. But we also see some at the bottom, right? But most of the larger business centers are going to be up toward the medical center, which makes a lot of sense. But, you know, Greater Houston has 3 separate little areas. So one is downtown, so you can see that those are going to be areas with much larger buildings, a lot of businesses inside those buildings, which is why you see a lot of these points, a lot of the pink points. And then there's one that's kind of on its own side, kind of on the east end of Houston, just off 45, right? And so that one it kind of stands alone, and not a whole lot of business activity happening in that area. When we look at the number of establishments, so we did see an increase in establishments and a big increase in employment. And going to Curtis's point here, so health services is the number one in Greater Houston. That's really driven by the area that's close to the medical center, right? So we did see a huge increase in the number of health service, in the amount of employment in health services. And it's driven by, the medical center and the expansion of the medical center. We also saw a big increase in business services, which is somewhat due to revitalization of downtown, I believe. So, we saw a lot of people moving into the downtown area. And then we look at, the over the market value analysis and business turnover. So you can see the larger area here that is South Houston, kind of southwestish, next to Sunnyside. You can see Sunnyside on the map here. Most of it is going to fall into that D category, right? Most of this corridor is falling into the D category. But there are some pockets where there's slightly weaker markets. And in those weaker markets, you see a lot more turnover. It's kind of evident when you look at this, how many businesses are moving out, but there's also a lot of businesses moving in. So there's a lot of churn happening there inside those areas. You can also see it in this one, which is an I market. So one of the weaker markets in the area, but you see a lot of business turnover there. But the other interesting thing is that you see a lot of development in these D markets, right? So these are all, let me go back. These are all clusters where we see businesses moving in or being born, but not a whole lot of people moving out of that area, right? So a lot of development in clusters here on the southern portion, which I believe is near the Aviva Stadium. So there's a new stadium that was built. I'm not sure how new it is, but there's a stadium very near to here. And then this cluster is very near to the Bayou City Event Center. And I'm not exactly sure where that cluster is, to be honest. I don't think that there's any big event center next to it, but there's definitely Bayou City Event Center right here. And of course, they're all very close to 610. So pretty centrally located, good location, and there's been a lot of development in that area. Okay, so just to wrap it up here, the summary of our key findings. Overall, we saw private investment increase across the city of Houston from 2014 to 2020. So we saw an increase in the number of establishments and an increase in the number of jobs. The increase in establishment is really driven by small businesses coming in and are concentrated mostly in service and retail industries, right? Especially if you're talking about food service as far as the retail is concerned, and business services as far as the service industry is concerned. Increases are most pronounced in East Downtown, where we saw the largest percentage increase. It's a slightly smaller corridor, but it's largest percentage increase. Southwest Houston, there's a lot of development happening there, uptown and near downtown. And then, the last point here, considering the percent change over time, you saw the very large numbers as far as percent change in those TERS areas. So in the commercial corridors, we see a high percentage change as far as the number of establishments in most of them and the number of employment in most of them. And that has outpaced the investment in the broader complete communities areas. That might be expected considering, what the TERS areas are put there to do, which they're put there to help to bring more investment to those areas. So, that might make sense in this case, but just a point that the TERS areas seem to be investment in the TERS areas has outpaced the complete communities at this point. And so lastly here, this is just, kind of a recap of things that we've touched on throughout. So how can the data be used? Doc mentioned a lot of how they're going to use the market value analysis, but one way that this EDI can support that is, thinking about those normative assumptions, places where you can leverage private investment. So this is identifying centers where private investment is occurring and, in what industries. Provides context for change to understand the changes in the housing market. So it's just one piece. There's a lot of things. This is very complex, right? So it's not really, it's just contribution. So it's not predictive, but it can help to further the discussion or create a reason for investigation, right? And understanding shifts in the industry can point to potential strengths or vulnerabilities. So I mentioned the increase in retail and COVID, right? So a lot of the increase in retail was driven by the increase in eating and drinking places. And we know COVID had a huge impact on those. And so that might be a slight vulnerability. If you see a big increase in a certain area, that's all, eating and drinking places, and then COVID happens and, those can all go away pretty quickly. So that's just something to think about. It adds a little bit to that. And then identifying where turnover is rapid. So we mentioned the relationship between private investment and the housing market. And areas that might be red flags are where turnover is rapid or there's vacancy for a very long period of time. So that can help provide some evidence and more reason to investigate some at-risk housing markets. So that's all that I have for this. Let me unshare. Are there any other questions before we move on? I'm sorry, I couldn't see the chat.
I don't have a question, but I will just add on to your last slide.
Okay.
That the data can all this data can also be used as a point in time. As we talked about this being a longitudinal assessment, the biggest thing is to be able to see what happened before. Right now, I think everybody's biggest thing is to see what happened before COVID, and we have that now. we have all the data before COVID. So this is a very important time because it's right before COVID. So it's very important data to have. And I also let everyone know that I will be pushing for another MVA EDI sooner than we usually get one, because I think there is a demand to actually see not only this point in time from this assessment and these analyses, but to be able to see, okay, what does it look like now today? And I think that's what everybody looking at data is time sensitive, right? So
Right.
when we get that data, as soon as we see that data, I'm pushing for that next MVA, because that's going to be very interesting picture to see in the city of Houston.
Yes. Thank you, Doc. Thanks for that. And Jacob, I'm sorry if I took too much time. I was trying to go through them.
No, that was great. That was great. So thank you, Brett. So in the last 15 minutes or so, we thought we'd share a little bit about some of the kind of underlying factors that we think have maybe contributed to changes in affordability and changes in market classification. Curtis and Renee, made some great points about other information that exists out there that different stakeholders have, that you all have, that can help point to, predictions going forward. So I thought we'd just give you a taste of kind of some of the ways that can be done with these following slides. Some of these also a little responsive to some of the questions we've had as we've done sort of these previous stakeholder meetings about things like, assessments and mortgage access kind of influencing market results. So we'll get into that a little bit. So the first thing we wanted to look at was the sort of relationship between these MBA classifications and access to credit through mortgages. Mortgages are really kind of like the lifeblood of communities and really critical for sustaining housing markets and helping them grow. So what we're showing here is on the left side of your screen, I'll look at the origination rates for home purchase mortgages across different housing prices. And what you see is there's a strong relationship between housing price and origination rate. So what you want to look at is this column here, which shows the share of applications that were actually originated for purchases. And like I said, among higher priced homes, so homes over 300,000, basically 90% of those applications were originated, compared with only 70% for homes under 150,000. And why is that critical? Well, because nearly 1 in 5 homes, about 20%, of homes that sold over the last 2 years were in that lower price range. So there's a gap in access to credit, at that sort of strata of the housing market. If we look at those same origination data across MBA categories, that's what this map shows here. You can see that, again, there's a strong relationship. So let me direct your eye to this first column. Again, this is showing the share of applications for home purchase mortgages that were originated. You can see in the strong markets, 75% or so of applications are being originated, whereas in those weaker markets, those origination rates are much lower. We talked about in those weaker markets, one of the factors that sort of characterizes them is less housing activity. And we can see that very clearly if we look at applications for home purchases. So in the stronger markets, there's nearly twice as many, not only just sales, but even applications for mortgage credit, as we see in these weaker, kind of yellow or orange markets. But it's not like there aren't sales occurring. There actually are sales and transactions occurring in these weaker markets. It's just they're being completed without mortgage credit, right? So these are going to be cash sales. These are going to be places where investors maybe have an advantage because they have access to different types of capital. The next factor we looked at, this is something that came up in a couple of our previous conversations, was the relationship between flood risk and historic flood patterns and changes in markets over time. So we looked at what this map is showing is FEMA's flood maps, different levels of flood risk across the city. And so what we wanted to do was understand how those overlay with our markets as well. So we looked at the share of homes in each housing market that were in 100-year, 500-year, or no floodplain at all. And you can see there's a sort of clear pattern here. This C market, which is one of the stronger markets in the city, has a sort of disproportionate share of homes in 100-year floodplain. And we also see in these I markets also a very high share. Here's a map of the city. Again, this is the 2022 MVA. And then again, just overlaying that flood risk map, you can see kind of what was shown on that previous slide. I'll just very quickly go through this. When we looked at the level of flood risk and how markets have changed over time, one of the things we see is that this seems to be kind of one of many, but a predictive factor for how markets changed. So among housing markets that saw their classification decline, right? So they went from blue in 2016 to orange in 2022. Areas that saw a decline had many more homes in flood risk. So among those places that declined, about 15% of homes were in a area that had flood risk, compared with 9% for places that improved. And we also see that among those block groups that improved their classification, so places that went from being yellow to purple or blue, 59% of them had very, very few homes at risk. So this seems to be one of those conditions that helps predict which markets will improve their MVA classification. One of the big factors driving sort of market classifications in our model was the level of renovation and development. And not surprisingly, when we look at where new construction development is happening, it's concentrated in areas that have lots of vacant land, right? That's where you can build the most cheaply. So we thought it might be interesting to look at, well, where does vacant land exist in the city, and what does that tell us about where we're going to expect to see these trends going forward? So what you see on the map on the right side of your screen is a little small, but is the level of vacant land across the city of Houston. You can see it's this is probably not surprising to you all, but concentrated in the sort of northeast and southeast. And again, this is doing kind of a similar table to what you saw earlier, looking at the share of residential land in each market, the share of residential vacant land in each market, and then the share of vacant land that does not have flood risk. So again, these are the areas that probably have the highest opportunity for development. And we can see they're concentrated in these sort of G and H markets. So these are places with high opportunity for new development and also potential for displacement. So be curious, Renee, to think about where in these places we see the sort of new platting happening and those kinds of trends. There's a question here about changes in. Oh yeah, go ahead, Curtis.
Jacob, just one other point about the replatting, and this might be an opportunity as well to look at that longitudinally to kind of bear out Renee's question. That is, looking at historic replatting data as it relates to vacant land and shifts in land value and actual improvements over time. Yeah. That could be an interesting confirmation of the impact of replatting on terms of direction of redevelopment.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. So let me pass it back over to Emily, and just in the last couple of minutes, talk a little bit about markets and affordability. Emily, let me pass it over to you.
Unmute, Emily. Please unmute.
Thanks, Doc. So affordability issues came up earlier in this call. And so we have one way of looking at sort of the extent to which a family at a given income level can access different types of markets across the city. And so these percentages that you see on this table are the percent of block groups in each of those MVA categories. So the percent in A, the percent in B, that a family earning that income you see can afford based on an understanding of the HUD definition that a family is likely to afford a house that's about 3 times their income. And so we look at this affordability for families earning at 200% of the area median income, 120, 100, so at the median income, and then at 80. And you can see that even for those families earning twice the median income, they are not going to be able to afford the typical house in an A, B, or C market. But they can access the majority of D and E market block groups. That drops off when you go to 120%, and then you see families earning 70,000 can't affordably access the typical house in a D or an E market. And when we drop down to the median D and E, You also see that fewer of the F's markets are affordable to families at that income level. So this makes sense, right? We know that people with lower incomes are going to be able to have access to fewer neighborhoods, but this helps sort of visualize the extent and levels at which people are cut off from certain more opportunity-rich neighborhoods. And then when we take a look at what that looks like on the map, next slide, please. So this is this map shows affordability for families earning 200% of the family median income, and those areas that are crossed off would be or hashed out are unaffordable to those families. So pretty much just the purples are off limits to the typical family making this income. Next slide. At 120, we start to see blues getting unaffordable. Next slide. At 100%, so a lot of the F markets are now unaffordable. And next slide. And we drop down to 80, which is associated with a lot of federal and state affordable housing programs. We see that much of the city is closed off except for those orange, the H and the I markets. Next slide. We know that median income varies within the city versus the region, as well as by race and ethnicity. So we also looked at the citywide median income, which is just $58,000, and then the median income for the median white, Black, and Hispanic household. So again, this isn't the full range of households, but the median. And so the median white family income allows a household to access most of the markets in F and G, but when we look at the city's median Black and Hispanic incomes, even the F and G markets are difficult to afford. And really everything in the I's are affordable and about half the H's when we're talking about the median Black and Hispanic families. And so you can see that opportunity is much more constrained at those levels. Next slide. And so this just highlights on the map for the white family income areas that are affordable. Next slide. For Black, we see that a lot of those areas that were affordable to the typical white family are now hatched out and unaffordable. And next slide. And same for Hispanic. The Hispanic income is a little bit higher than Black, but still a lot of the city is unaffordable. Next slide. Any questions about that? I'm speeding through it a bit just because we're short on time.
Can I make a point real quick?
Sure.
Okay, so we follow very closely because my department, we also administer the Harris County Housing Finance Corporation, follow real closely some of the work from Texas A&M Real Estate Research Center, Dr. Claire Losey. She presented recently at a state conference on housing finance corporations. Her analysis indicates that now, because interest rates at roughly the 7% or more range, that a starter home that is considered $250,000 that is unapproachable by a large segment of the population, it takes someone making roughly $84,000 to afford that home at 3 times their income, and that a commensurate 5% reduction in cost of home has to occur as well. But I mean, if you look at that kind of scenario, $70,000 for a family of 4 is 80% of median. So I mean, you're looking at housing even in areas that you would consider that are not that prime for investment or housing opportunities, just simply unreachable by a large segment of the population. So there's just a point that I want to amplify of the unattainable reach of housing, other than providing subsidies that are well over $100,000 and likely a land trust model to occur. So just a point that I'd like to make in all of this.
You're right. You're absolutely right about those interest rates right now, making things much more unaffordable for a lot of families. So thank you for pointing that out. All right. Any other questions about those affordability maps? All right. So the displacement risk ratio is something we developed because in a lot of places, people are concerned when they see falling prices, but then they're concerned when they see rising prices, so they think some households might not be able to keep up with those prices. And so the concern is that households might be forced to leave due to circumstances sort of beyond their control, whether that's excuse me, rising taxes or rising rents, and that so we developed a measure of likelihood that longtime residents might be displaced because of rising costs. And this model mostly focuses on homeowners because we have better data on sales than we do on rents. And it does assume that households should pay about 3 times their income to purchase a home, although, of course, we know, as you just said, the rising interest rates make that a lot of a tighter crunch. Next slide. I won't go into detail too much on this, but happy to talk with anyone more in detail about how we do this. So to calculate the displacement risk ratio, we first look at income in a fixed starting year to get a sense of what the income of longtime residents might be, who lived there at the beginning of the study period. So in this case, we looked at incomes in 2015 and 2016. Then we used inflation to calculate to update those incomes for current years up to 21-22, which is when our sales data was for. And then we calculate the ratio of resident income, the long-term resident income to actual home prices over time. And then we adjust for the city average, knowing that, which is really important in a city like Houston to be able to tease out where the most extreme appreciation is related to income versus just the general appreciation that's happening everywhere. Higher DRR values reflect higher displacement risk. Lower values can actually reflect disinvestment in some cases. So that can also be cause for concern if they're low and falling. High and rising, low and falling, and then in the middle we have stable, relatively stable or slowly changing markets. Next slide. So this graph on the left shows these are 3 neighborhoods in Philadelphia and the different trend lines for them in terms of their displacement risk ratios. So you can see that neighborhood number 1 in blue has sort of a steady relationship of income, of housing price to income over time. And so it's just about at the affordable level, but remains about the same and goes up and comes down a little bit. Red is about at the city average, so very affordable to the families who live there. It has not been changing over time. But yellow is a neighborhood that began to experience what looks like gentrification in about 2011. Really steep gentrification. Gentrification isn't always that steep, but in a few of our neighborhoods in Philadelphia, and I'm sure a few of your neighborhoods in Houston, you see this kind of extreme change in just a couple of years, and this can happen. And that's the kind of neighborhood where we're most worried about displacement. This table that's on the right, this is how we look at displacement risk combined with our MBA. So we sort of simplify the MBA into just 3 categories of the strongest to the middle and the weakest, and then cross that with the highest pressure markets, stable areas, and then lagging markets. And in general, policymakers, advocates, general people are not that concerned about what's happening in the strong markets because they're still so strong. If prices go up there, they were already high. If prices are coming down a little bit, maybe because they just hit a ceiling. But what we're concerned about, and what policy is generally concerned about, is the middle markets and weaker markets that might lose affordability for folks who would like to stay as neighborhoods improve, and the lagging markets where you might worry about disinvestment. Next slide. So those red areas on the map are places where we saw big increases from 2015 to 16 in the displacement risk ratio. And that's where we'd expect to see the most risk of resident displacement. And so I think you will probably remember from those earlier maps, a lot of those were the orange neighborhoods and yellow neighborhoods. All right, next slide. And so this is the result of putting the MVA and the DRR together. And so these are those same colors you saw in that table, where the green are the areas where there's most concern with affordability, with displacement. Those are areas that were either middle or weak markets that saw high displacement, high pressure. And the brown areas are places that were middle or weak markets that had falling displacement pressure. So that's where you would want to be on the lookout for possible decline or disinvestment. But those dark greens are the areas where we'd expect to see price displacement. Next slide. Is that it? Oh, that's it. All right. So any questions on the DRR? Do you want to flip back to that slide, Jacob, in case folks have questions?
Emily, I will say that, of course, this is kind of like like I spoke of earlier. I am so curious to be able to utilize these layers to see what the next MVA and EDI looks like. And all these will be layers. I just wanted to say these are all layers. So if we were able to put one interactive map and date them, I just want everybody, I'm sure everybody is waiting to see the next point in time, because I know I am. But I'm sure with all these layers of the past, we can always, we'll be able to go in the future and see, look at these same layers and then see what is in the future, right? What kind of, how the data looks in the future, and be able to see the change over time and see what happened to these areas. And I'm just so curious to see that. I'm sure everybody else is as well. But thank you for the presentation. Unless there's any more questions, that will conclude the MVA EDI presentation. And please feel free. Please know that if you're on this, you will get the copy of you should get a copy of the MS Teams. We are going to package things to put on the Housing Resource and Data Center, so everyone can have equal access to that. And, with that, I bid you adieu. Everyone have a great day. Thank you very much, Reinvestment Fund and Working Partners.
Thank you so much, Doc, and thanks to everybody for being on the call and everyone who asked us really good questions. We really appreciate it. And thanks, Working Partner, for all your work too. And Curtis.
Thanks, guys. Great work. Great work. We've got a lot of interest, and in the memo we'll have a lot of interesting comments about this work. It's right on time.
Wonderful. All right. Take care, everybody.
Take care.
Bye.